Over the seasons, almost every melee balance change seems to follow the same pattern. Damage goes down, range is reduced, environmental interactions are removed, attack combos are simplified, emergent mechanics are stifled. And yet the problems continue to persist. And melee remains as one of the most controversial parts of the finals, despite being one of the weakest. This raises an important question. What if the problem isn't derived from any individual melee weapon? What if the problem is the framework that melee operates within? After releasing the Winchclaw redesign, many people expected the next episode to focus on another gadget or weapon, and that was originally the plan. But as I began working through Sword, Spear, Riot Shield, and the rest of the melee roster, I kept running into the same issue. Every melee weapon was suffering from many of the same underlying problems. Attack spam, readability, enemy frustration, limited decision making. This idea was further cemented by the Season 10 AMA, where Matt discussed the team's plans for the Season 11 melee rework.
So it's hard for the melee user, and so at the same time it's both high skill and challenging, and then also seen as low skill at the moment right now.
Now, regardless of our thoughts on the ideas introduced there, they do highlight a problem that exists in virtually all FPS games that feature melee. How do we keep these weapons viable and fun while preventing them from feeling overtuned and overly frustrating? Remember, the weapons themselves don't have to be unfair mechanically. So long as they are perceived to be unfair, they might as well be. So in this video, we are addressing that very problem. Not through sweeping nerfs and not by piling on dozens of new mechanics or limitations. Instead, we will be making a handful of small but meaningful changes to the core melee framework itself. Before we can rework Dagger, Sword, Dual Blades, Riot Shield, Sledgehammer, or Spear, we first need to modify the system they all share. Today, we're not redesigning a weapon. We're redesigning melee. So, why do FPS games even feature melee weapons? What purpose do they serve? Well, for starters, I think we need to be careful on how we compare melee with its ranged alternatives. Melee is inherently disadvantaged. Compared to guns, melee offers less range, less flexibility, more risk, and greater positioning requirements. If melee simply tried to compete with guns on equal terms, it would almost always lose. Therefore, melee must offer something unique. For many, melee offers 3 different qualities that other, more traditional weapons tend not to. One is risk. Melee voluntarily places the user in danger at all times. To be effective, you must enter the opponent's effective range long before you have a chance to fight back. The next is commitment. Melee attacks are locked-in actions. Its users cannot instantly disengage halfway through. Every attack carries lasting consequences. The last one is reward. In exchange for that risk and commitment, melee gains access to advantages unavailable to ranged weapons. High burst damage, resource independence, powerful close-range pressure, unique utility, and hands-on, action-packed gameplay all the time. But, over time, many melee systems begin drifting away from these principles. Instead of risk, commitment, and reward, the gameplay slowly becomes run forward, swing repeatedly, and hope something connects. the commitment fades. The skill expression evaporates. The distinction between good and bad melee play becomes less clear. The goal of this redesign, then, is not to make melee weaker or to make melee stronger. It is to make melee more deliberate. Good melee play should be rewarded. Poor melee habits ought to be discouraged. And opponents should better understand what is happening in engagements with melee. The overarching problem is that modern melee systems often struggle to encourage that kind of deliberate, calculated play. Instead, they frequently reward behaviors that are frustrating both to fight against and to balance. So, before we can redesign individual melee weapons, we first need to identify the fundamental issues baked into the melee system. For melee as a whole, I have identified 3 overarching problems that affect both the melee users and those encountering them. So, let's address each of these one at a time. Problem 1. Melee inadvertently encourages spam. Or, at the very least, it enables it. Many melee weapons, both through their timings and their animation patterns, naturally foster repeated attack attempts. When an attack misses, little changes. The player simply swings again. Over time, melee gameplay, especially at a lower level, can deteriorate into just keep attacking until something connects, rather than strategically choose the correct moment to attack. This alternate style of play weakens commitment, neglects precision, and dilutes skill expression. The difference between a calculated attack and a reckless one has become smaller than it should be. Now, developers often respond to these issues with simple stat adjustments like damage nerfs, range nerfs, and mobility nerfs. But these don't actually target the behavior. These are what I would call symptomatic nerfs, because the devs are responding to the symptoms rather than the actual disease. These adjustments aren't actually solving any of the aforementioned problems. They're simply making melee weaker. Problem 2. Melee suffers from readability issues.
And so often what happens is, as a gun user getting attacked by a melee user, you end up in this position that you're just getting, like, somebody appeared out of nowhere, they're on top of you and just mash, right?
However, the complaint is often akin to, I never knew they were there, rather than, the weapon dealt too much damage. This creates an important distinction, and it is something that several people pointed out to me in the comment section of my last video. A mechanic does not need to be unfair to feel unfair. Perception matters. So, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on the topic, as it has helped me to adjust my position here. The reality is that if players feel like they were giving no information, then the interaction becomes frustrating regardless of balance. The difficulty here is that just straight up nerfing melee to counteract this, once again, does not solve the problem. In fact, it punishes melee for playing correctly. Melee is designed for its users to approach around corners, through destruction, from vertical angles, during chaotic fights, often without providing meaningful warning. This is how melee deals with their lack of range. The issue isn't necessarily melee damage. No, the issue is availability of information. And problem 3. Melee lacks universal balancing tools. This is a very simple concept, but it ultimately provides the developers with a lot more control over how melee is executed without needing to manually change each and every melee weapon individually. Traditionally, when melee becomes problematic, developers often have limited options. They usually end up adjusting damage or range or mobility. Every time a melee weapon becomes problematic, devs are forced to solve the problem weapon by weapon. And, to be fair, changing universal components of melee is difficult because every melee weapon is so different. A nerf that works for sword may be unnecessarily punishing for sledgehammer. The core problem, in this case, is that there is no universal framework governing melee behavior in the finals. And, as a result, every problem must be solved individually. So what melee needs is not more nerfs. What it needs is a framework that can influence behavior across the entire melee roster. So, we have three interconnected problems. Melee often encourages spam, it frequently struggles with readability, and it lacks universal balancing tools. The solution, then, is not to redesign every melee weapon individually. The solution is to create a framework that they are all able to share. If we're going to redesign melee, we first need to establish a few principles. Because the goal here isn't to completely overhaul the mechanics. Melee, as it stands right now, has a loyal user base for a reason. It's intense, high commitment, and unlike any other weapon archetype in the game. We want to retain the qualities that make melee so satisfying to wield. We're going to start off with an easy one. Principle 1. Preserve melee's identity. The primary goal should be preserving the core fantasy discussed in Stage 1. Melee should remain aggressive, close-ranged, high commitment, and high reward. Melee should still feel dangerous both for the user and for its opponents. The identity is here to stay. Principle 2. Commitment should matter. This is probably the most important principle. When a melee user swings, that decision should matter. When they miss, that miss should matter. When they choose to engage, that choice should matter. Fundamentally, the problem is not that melee players are permitted to miss. The problem is that repeated misses often carry very little consequence. A healthy melee system should distinguish between deliberate attacks and reckless ones. Principle 3. Information enforces fairness. As mentioned earlier, a mechanic does not need to be mechanically unfair to feel unfair in practice. Players should generally have access to enough information to understand what is happening around them. The goal is readability, but not exposure. And Principle 4. Universal systems are better than individual exceptions. Whenever possible, melee should be governed by shared rules rather than dozens of weapon-specific fixes. This helps create consistency. A healthy framework should influence behavior across the roster, provide easy access balancing levers for developers, and preserve individual weapon identities as a result. The goal here is establishing a common foundation. So, what would that framework actually look like? I have two major systems to introduce to melee in the game. The first, and most important one, is the overextension system. The core mechanic of this system is that every missed melee attack creates an overextension timer in the background. That timer lasts 8 seconds. Each missed swing creates its own independent timer that does not interact with any of the others. Defensive actions, like blocking with the riot shield, do not count. These timers are always a fixed 8 seconds long, regardless of which melee weapon the player is using. This means that faster weapons can accumulate overextension faster. Slower weapons accumulate it slower. This is intentional. Sword naturally receives more pressure than Sledgehammer in this system because Sword naturally has more opportunities to spam. Now let's introduce the consequences. There is a threshold of 4 active overextension timers. If 4 overextension timers are running simultaneously, meaning the melee user missed their attacks 4 times within 8 seconds, the user becomes fatigued. When a melee player is fatigued, they have 75% attack speed, and 90% movement speed. These values have been chosen carefully so as to disincentivize melee spam without crippling the user. The purpose is to make reckless play feel inefficient. These effects will also be accompanied by appropriate audio feedback. Because the melee user is not directly shown how many overextension timers are active at any given point, they are provided a warning state when 3 timers are active, which includes slightly heavier breathing and a subtle HUD overlay cue like faint sweat. If a player becomes fully fatigued, then they will hear heavy breathing and a more direct HUD overlay cue, along with exhaustion wisps that can be seen both from first person and third person, meaning other players can see you are fatigued. Now, your fatigued state does not automatically end after a certain amount of time passes. Without additional safeguards, melee users could repeatedly oscillate between fatigued and non-fatigued states as overextension timers expire and reappear. This is messy. To solve this, we will be using a hysteretic system. Hysteresis is the phenomenon where the state of a system depends not only on its current input, but also on its past history. So, how do we utilize this here? Well, consider how fatigue is initially triggered at 4 concurrent overextension timers. To complement this, we will have fatigue dissipate when you are reduced down to 2 concurrent overextension timers. This makes fatigue feel like a meaningful state. Players must now actually recover, not simply wait out the hard-coded time. And this is the overextension system. It may sound a little complicated at first, but in time I think you might see how elegant of a solution it is. Not because it is complex, but because it very deliberately, yet very carefully addresses the issue of spamming while not incorporating a simple stamina bar. It indirectly discourages reckless melee play without punishing proper usage in chaotic environments. It does not punish frequent melee use, it punishes frequent misses. Our second system to introduce is a much simpler one: specialized melee weapon audio. This addresses the second issue we cited earlier, which was readability. With this system, each melee weapon now produces subtle movement-related equipment sounds. Swords will clink, riot shields will groan, spear will rattle. This helps to address the problem that many ranged users expressed: the idea that melee appeared out of nowhere and started swinging. Especially when you consider how difficult spatial audio is to dissect in the finals, this modified audio design tells players that a melee user is nearby more than it points them to a specific direction. On top of this, you could even incorporate more decision-making options for the melee users by having sprinting produce full noise, walking cause reduced noise, and crouching make no noise. This way, melee retains stealth. It simply requires deliberate choices to achieve it. Now, the volume of these melee sounds could be experimented on. You wouldn't want it to be too loud to the point that melee loses its stealth, but you also wouldn't want it too soft to where it isn't even worth having. But I'm confident there's a middle ground where these sounds provide additional information without compromising melee's ability to approach undetected. The beauty of these two systems is that they create universal balancing levers. Developers can now influence melee behavior without repeatedly resorting to damage, range, or mobility nerfs. They can adjust time duration, fatigue threshold, recovery threshold, fatigue severity, audio level, and more without ever needing to touch sword damage or spear range or riot shield combos or dagger mechanics. This gives developers a framework capable of influencing melee behavior and capacity cleanly packaged within one system. And finally, one small change I'd make to melee as a whole is restoring multi-hit to the few melee attacks that lost it. The current system, with daggers and sledges secondaries only being able to hit one target at a time, punishes healthy gameplay that normally would work with melee players but doesn't with these specific weapons. Removing these exceptions to multi-hit would help reward successful positioning, remove arbitrary exceptions, restore Melee's crowd control potential, erase punitive outcomes for standard behavior, and ensure that all Melee attacks follow consistent rules. Given how rare it is for multi-hit opportunities to occur, I think this is a perfectly healthy and rational change to make that should have never been taken away in the first place. So that's how I would incorporate a Melee framework in the finals. We discussed how Melee is built around risk, commitment, and reward. The problem is that many modern Melee systems struggle to reinforce those principles consistently. This design attempts to address those issues at the system level rather than at the weapon level. More importantly, this framework isn't really the destination. It's the foundation. Every Melee weapon in the finals faces its own unique challenges. And that's exactly where we're going next. Because once this framework has been established, we can finally start looking at individual weapons through a healthier lens. So next time, we'll be taking a look at a certain defensive Melee weapon, how it has lost some of its abilities, and what we can do to not only make it more dynamic, but also give it more options when it comes to pressure, defense, and Melee counterplay.